Hi, welcome to another one of these video chats looking at the China-Iran relationship. I'm very happy today to have Professor Mehran Kamrava, Professor of Government at Georgetown University in Doha. He's one of the most prolific scholars, authors on Gulf IR, Iranian politics. He is the man. He's also the author of this great book that's right behind me, Triumph and Despair, which I think is, to me, one of the books that I've learned the most about Iranian politics in the past few years. Just a fantastic book. Mehran, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for having me, and thank you for that warm introduction. Really appreciate it.
Well, very true introduction. So we're going to talk a little bit about not so much just China, but just in general, how the look east concept in Iran shapes its larger foreign policy agenda. You hosted a really interesting workshop on this last year in Doha, and I was really fascinated with a lot of the conversations that folks were having about this. So, what is the significance of look east for Iran's foreign policy?
Well, there's, as you know, there have been increasing tensions between Iran and the European Union and the United States over the last several decades. And those tensions, unfortunately, not only have they not been lessened, but they've expanded in terms of scope. Just recently, in fact, for example, there was a joint EU GCC meeting in which the European Union called the three islands that are disputed between Iran and the UAE occupied. And that is just the latest episode, latest example of tensions between Iran and the European Union. There have been various incidents of lowering of temperature between Iran and the West. For example, in 2015, with the signing of the so-called nuclear agreement. But of course, the JCPOA has been in tatters ever since the Americans pulled out in 2018. And so Iran has resorted to improving its relations with countries outside of the West, whether they've been Russia, China, India, or in Latin America, for example, Venezuela and Bolivia, and of course, Africa. So for Iran, East has included anything that's been outside of the West. And in that sense, there's been a deliberate effort on the part of the Iranian government, going all the way back actually to the late 1980s, to improve its relations with non-European states. But this policy became formalized during the Raisi presidency after the 2021 elections. And so the Look East policy has now been an official pillar of the foreign policy of Iran.
And so that holds post Raisi under the new administration. This is still the signals that this is going to continue to be a load-bearing pillar.
Absolutely. In fact, President Pezeshkian, right after his election, started giving talks in which he said Iran's Look East policy will not necessarily change, but we also want dialogue with the European Union. That dialogue has been increasingly more difficult given recent regional developments, one of which I mentioned. But yeah, the Look East policy has not necessarily changed. Iran wants to complement that with dialogue and discussion with the European Union and with the United States. But the Look East policy hasn't changed.
Sure. So you mentioned Russia, you mentioned India, you mentioned a lot of countries, and of course, something that's been very interesting the past couple of years is Iran's membership in these international organizations that are kind of post-Western in their orientation. I'm thinking the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. Are these standalone events, or is this part of this broader, Look East agenda?
No, it's part of the broader look east agenda. The assumption is in Tehran, rightly or wrongly, that the international system is in transition, that the unipolar moment in which the United States was the dominant force internationally is over, has long been over, in fact, and that the international order is in a profound process of transition, and that Iran needs to play an important consequential role in the crafting of a new international system. And part of that important role is Iran's membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in the BRICS, and also in enhancing its relationship with its neighbors. So, in many ways, not only is Iran's membership in the BRICS and the CSO important, but an important component of the look east policy is the so-called good neighborly relations that Iran has been embarked on. Again, that has not been easy because of certain built-in systemic tensions and characteristics within the GCC, Iran GCC relations, Iran's relations with Turkey, Iran's relations with Azerbaijan. But yes, you're absolutely right. The membership of the Islamic Republic in the BRICS and in CSO is part of this broader look east policy.
That's really interesting because when you're talking about this good neighbor policy, um, I live in Abu Dhabi. We've seen this over the past 4 or 5 years that the way people talk about Iran has changed. Um, there's an idea like, especially post-Arab Spring, that tensions just were reaching this unbearable, level. And just in different events I've done where it used to be the first question would always be about how Iran can't be trusted and we need to work together to counterbalance against it. People don't talk openly like that anymore. It's more like, how can we work with Iran to lower the temperature? At the same time, like you said, there's a lot of stuff happening in the region. And I wonder, when I think look east and I think more geographically, obviously the relationship with China is what I think about the most. There is this shared affinity between the Iranians and Chinese and the Russians and a lot of countries, this developing a multipolar or polycentric or however you want to frame it. I think there's a lot of convergence at the systemic level where, Iran and these countries agree. But then I look at the regional level, and I think sometimes China's interests in the Middle East don't always line up with Iran's interests in the Middle East. What's your take on that? Do you get this idea that this consensus at the global level maybe doesn't work out so much on the regional Middle East level?
Probably, yes. The Iranians have been quite careful in differentiating their foreign policy. So they can agree on certain respects with a number of actors, and they can either look the other way or agree to disagree. They've done this very carefully with India, for example, over its treatment of Muslim populations. They're doing that. They've done that with China in relation to the Uyghurs, and also in terms of China's foreign relations. Again, the Chinese expressed support for the UAE's claim on these disputed islands, and the Iranians expressed their displeasure, but that they were very careful to make sure that the overall nature of the close relationship between Iran and the People's Republic remained the same. So you're absolutely right. They've been able to disaggregate the nature of their relationship at the global versus the regional levels.
That's interesting because I was reading in the Tehran Times this morning, a Chinese Iran specialist, Jin Liangxiang, had written an op-ed talking about the nature of the comprehensive strategic partnership that the two countries signed in 2016 and formalized in 2021, I guess. And it's very fluid in the way you're describing Iran, how you can focus on interests or mutual issues of mutual concern, and then in areas where your interests diverge, then let's put that on the back burner. And that's very much the strategy China uses in its partnerships to say, look, there's going to be things we don't work well on. So let's kind of focus on the other things that we can and try to build trust and cooperation and see if we get a little closer on the other stuff.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you should mention the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. When it was announced, there was tremendous nationalist backlash inside Iran against it. And ironically, this was announced during the Rouhani administration, which was kind of viewed as much closer to popular sensibilities than the Raisi administration that followed it. But over time, the people were either desensitized or discussion of the comprehensive partnership was pushed into the back burner. And the Iranians are quite keen on it at the official level, at the state level.
Yeah, at the state level, I'm sure. At the popular level, my impression from the outside is that Iranians are a pretty contentious bunch. You see a lot of different competing narratives about the relationship with, well, on most things, but especially the relationship with China.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the quite interesting things is that it's a relationship that is uh, recognized by opinion makers inside Iran and by Iranian pundits as being of instrumental use
Mm.
to Iran. It's instrumentally useful as a counterweight to the overt hostility of the European Union and the United States to Iran. But it isn't viewed as something that in the long term would serve Iran's national interests.
That's interesting because I was just thinking a minute ago about how you mentioned the JCPOA. After that was signed, Iran immediately, started working with the Europeans again in a way that they hadn't for quite a while. And I think within China, that was the cause of no small amount of resentment because the Chinese felt that they'd done a lot to get Iran to the table, and then once it was signed off, they were expecting more, and Iran suddenly had other options, and China it wasn't the prettiest girl at the dance anymore. It does seem to me often that these are kind of instrumental, like you say, on both sides.
Absolutely. And Jonathan, one of the interesting things is even the current generation of Iranian policy elites are Eurocentric. Their views are geared towards Europe. And when they view China or relations with India or Russia or non-European actors, again, it is kind of for instrumental reasons, although their assumptions, their approach, their ideals are rooted uh, uh, in in things European and Western. And so I think that's maybe at some point there will be a generation of Iranian policy elites who will have a different orientation. But for the time being, the orientation of Iran's policymakers remains primarily Europe, as does the basis, even after 40 years of sanctions, as does the basis of Iran's economic development.
I see the same factors at play here, although different because just the scope of the relationship isn't as intense. But despite all the hype of China becoming this major actor, most folks that I talk to here still are thinking more towards Europe or the US. Very few people at the popular level really understand China yet. Not too many people are studying it formally. It still seems quite foreign to most people on this side of the Gulf.
Absolutely. Well, it's like that in Iran as well.
No doubt. Mehran, this is really interesting. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Jonathan, it's always a pleasure talking to you. You're one of the reasons why this part of the world, our neck of the woods, has emerged as not just a political and economic epicenter, but also something that's so intellectually rewarding. And I'm grateful to have had an opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Well, if you keep complimenting like me like this, we'll have a lot more conversations.
It'll be a pleasure.
Thanks, Mehran. Have a great weekend, buddy.
Thank you. You too, Jonathan. Take care.